My son-in-law pointed at the front door and said, very calmly, very clearly, "This arrangement isn't working anymore, Eleanor. Maybe it's time you found somewhere more suitable for a woman your age." Then he smiled. That smile was the last thing I expected, because behind him, my daughter said nothing. She stood by the kitchen counter with her arms folded and her eyes looking somewhere past my shoulder, like I was already gone. They thought I would crumble. They thought 64 years of living had made me soft. What they forgot was this. My name was on every single document, every mortgage payment, every property tax receipt for the past 22 years. And before that hour was over, I had already picked up the phone to call my real estate agent. My name is Eleanor Marsh, and I was 64 years old. The spring, my daughter and her husband moved into my condominium and began treating it like I was the guest. If you had passed me on the street that April, you might have seen a retired schoolteacher in a beige raincoat, sensible boots, and reading glasses pushed up into gray hair that needed a trim. You might have thought, quiet woman, probably harmless, probably lonely since her husband passed. You might have assumed I was easy to manage. That was exactly what my son-in-law Garrett assumed. He should have read my report cards. Every student I ever taught knew that I was patient right up until I wasn't, and when I stopped being patient, the change was permanent. It started the way these things usually do, not with a shout, not with a confrontation, but with something small enough to dismiss, a comment about the light fixtures, a suggestion that the living room felt dated, a quiet rearranging of the pantry because Garrett said the layout wasn't efficient. My daughter's name is Claire. She was 36 that year, 12 years married to Garrett, and they had been in my condo for 5 months when the real trouble began. They had come to me the previous November after Garrett's consulting firm lost 2 major contracts and their rental in Mississauga became something they could no longer afford. Claire called on a Sunday evening, voice careful, words rehearsed. "Just until Garrett gets the next contract," she said. 6 weeks, maybe 8. "We'll cover utilities," she said. I believed her because she was my daughter, and because I had always found it easier to say yes to Claire than to watch her struggle. My husband Douglas had died 3 years before that. Heart attack, very sudden, the October, after we had finally paid off the mortgage. We had planned to travel. We had talked about the East Coast, about renting a small boat in Nova Scotia, about taking the train across the country the way neither of us had ever done. Instead, I learned what grief felt like when it sits permanently in the chair across from you at the breakfast table. The condo was Douglas and mine. We had chosen every detail together, the wide windows facing north, the warm-toned floors, the built-in shelving in the study where he kept his books and where I kept the ceramic owl my mother had given me when I got my teaching certificate. That owl had sat on the same shelf for 19 years. The first week Claire and Garrett moved in, Garrett moved it to the storage closet without asking. He said it made the room feel cluttered. I brought it back out and placed it on the shelf without saying a word to him. 2 days later, it was in the closet again. I brought it out again. It was a small thing. I told myself it was a small thing. Then Douglas's books started disappearing. Not all at once. One here, one there. I noticed because I had kept them exactly as he had left them, partly sentiment, partly because I used to run my fingers along the spine sometimes on quiet evenings when I missed him most. By February, an entire row was gone. When I asked Claire, she said Garrett had donated a few to make room for his home office setup. He needed the shelf for his monitor and his external drives. His home office. In my study. In the room where Douglas read every night of our married life. I said, very steadily, that I would have liked to be asked first. Claire said she was sorry, that it had happened quickly, that Garrett hadn't realized I was attached to them, as though keeping your late husband's books was a quirk requiring explanation. I let it go. I told myself they were stressed. I told myself a temporary inconvenience was manageable. But I had been a teacher for 31 years. I knew the difference between a student having a hard week and a student who had decided the rules did not apply to them, and by March, Garrett had the look of someone who had decided the rules did not apply. He began having business calls in the living room at hours that made the evenings uncomfortable. He invited 2 colleagues over for dinner without mentioning it to me until that same afternoon. When I came home from my weekly coffee with my neighbor Pauline and found 4 people I had never met eating takeout containers spread across my dining table, Garrett introduced me to them as Claire's mother, said I live there too, and turned back to his conversation. Claire mouthed sorry at me from across the room. That sorry came a lot. It had started to feel like a screen door. It let the words through but kept none of the cold out. The thing that changed everything was not dramatic. It rarely is. It was a Thursday afternoon in late March, and I came home from my cardiologist appointment earlier than expected. I am fine. Nothing serious. Douglas's death had made me careful about checkups. I came in through the side entrance and hung up my coat and heard Garrett on the phone in the study, door half open, voice low but not low enough. I stood in the hallway and I listened. He was speaking to someone, and from the pauses and the rhythm, it was someone who already knew the situation. He said, "She's not going to be a problem." He said, "Claire keeps her calm." He said, "We just need her signature on the management agreement, and then the property address is ours to use for the business registration and the financing application." He said, "Once the bank sees a Mississauga address attached to the portfolio, the loan goes through, and after that, we restructure the lease agreement so that she's a secondary tenant." He laughed a little at something the other person said. Then he said, "She's 64 and she trusts Claire completely. It won't take long." I stood very still in my own hallway. Secondary tenant. In my own home, I did not move for what felt like a long time. The ceramic owl was on the kitchen counter, where I had placed it that morning after finding the study shelf rearranged again. I looked at it from the hallway. My mother had given it to me in 1984. I had carried it through 4 moves, 2 provinces, and 22 years in this building. My name was on the deed of this building. I went quietly to my bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Douglas's photograph on the nightstand. It was taken the summer before he died, on the dock at my sister's cottage in Muskoka. He was laughing at something off camera, one hand shielding his eyes from the sun. He had a way of laughing that made everyone nearby want to know what was funny. "Douglas," I said quietly, "our daughter married a man who thinks I'm an obstacle." That night at dinner, I was pleasant. I asked Garrett how his calls had gone. He said, "Fine, busy, things were picking up." Claire talked about a friend's renovation project. I ate my soup and nodded and said the right things, and all the while I was thinking very carefully about what I needed to do. The next morning, after Garrett left for a meeting and Claire went to her yoga class, I called my old friend Renata. Renata had been a family law paralegal for 27 years before she retired, and she had the kind of clarity that cuts through fog without needing to raise her voice. I told her what I had heard. I read her the exact phrasing as closely as I could remember it. Management agreement, secondary tenant, financing application. Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Eleanor, don't sign anything. Don't let them frame this as a favor or a formality. And I would strongly suggest speaking to your real estate lawyer before the week is out. Those words, secondary tenant, are not small words. Those words are a legal category." I thanked her. Then I called Andrew Cito, who had handled Douglas's estate and the title transfer when the property came solely into my name. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I might need his advice. He said, "Come in Friday morning," and I said I'd be there. I did not tell Claire about either call. The following Tuesday was when Garrett brought out the papers. He came to the kitchen after dinner, folder in hand, demeanor pleasant in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed pleasantness. He said he wanted to go over something quick with both of us, just a simple business matter, nothing complicated. He set the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were several pages, font dense and close, with highlighted lines near the bottom of 2 of them. He slid the top page toward me. He said it was a property management authorization. He said it was standard language for using a residential address in a business filing. He said all it did was confirm that his company operated from this address. I looked at the highlighted line. It said, "Owner, resident authorizes management rights to be exercised jointly." Jointly. I closed the folder. Garrett's smile thinned. "Is there a problem?" I said I'd want to read it fully before signing anything. He said it was really very straightforward, that his lawyer had already reviewed it. I said that was fine, and I'd have my lawyer review it too. The room changed after that. Not loudly, but it changed. Garrett picked up the folder with a careful steadiness that told me he was working to keep his face neutral. Claire looked at the table. I picked up my tea and drank it. That night, I heard them arguing in the bedroom they were using. I couldn't make out words, only tones. Garrett sharp and clipped, Claire quieter, defensive. At one point, I heard my name. The next morning, I drove to Andrew Cito's office and laid everything out for him. What I'd heard in the hallway, what the papers said, what Renata had told me. Andrew read the highlighted sections. He leaned back in his chair. He said, "Eleanor, this clause, if signed, would give him grounds to claim co-management authority over the property in a number of financial and legal contexts. It would complicate your ability to sell, refinance, or make independent decisions about the unit without his formal agreement." He said, "I want to be clear with you. This is not standard language." I drove home and I was very calm. That is what a certain kind of anger does when it has time to set properly. It stops feeling like heat. It starts feeling like something solid. The confrontation came on a Wednesday morning in April. A cold morning, the kind where spring looks close from the window but hasn't arrived. I was in the kitchen making coffee when Garrett came in dressed for a meeting. He said he needed an answer on the papers by end of week because his filing deadline was approaching. He said he understood I was cautious, but that this was important and that family helped each other move forward. Family helped each other. I turned from the counter and looked at him. I said, "I had those papers reviewed." Something passed across his face very quickly. I said, "My lawyer tells me that management authorization clause is not standard language." I said, "I also want to be honest with you. I know what secondary tenant means. I heard your phone call 3 weeks ago." Garrett was still for exactly 1 second. Then he said I must have misunderstood. Then he said I was taking things out of context. Then he said, voice tightening, that he and Claire had been nothing but respectful and that this was a difficult situation for them too. Claire came into the kitchen then, drawn by the quiet. She looked between us and said, "What's going on?" I said, "Your husband has been planning to file legal documentation using my property as collateral for his business loan, and the papers he asked me to sign would have given him co-management rights over this unit." The silence was long. Claire turned to Garrett. Her face was doing something complicated that I had seen before, years ago, when she was 16 and had broken something valuable and was deciding whether to lie about it. Garrett said I was catastrophizing. He said the papers were routine. He said I was making things difficult because I had never fully accepted him into the family. That last part was supposed to hurt. It would have hurt once. I had spent 12 years working to accept Garrett, working to find the good in him, working to stay quiet when he was unkind at family dinners or dismissive of things Douglas had built. I had put in 12 years of work on behalf of my daughter's marriage. I said, "I'm not catastrophizing, I'm reading." Claire said, "Garrett, did you know I would say that?" He turned to her and said she was supposed to help him manage this, and that was the word he used, manage, and I watched my daughter hear it. She said, "Manage what?" "Me managing my mother?" He said, "That is not what I meant." But the pause before he said it was a pause that answered the question on its own. I left them in the kitchen and went to my bedroom. I sat at the small desk by the window where I used to mark papers, where Douglas used to bring me tea without asking. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. I knew exactly what I was going to do. The following morning, I called my real estate agent, Joan Ferreira, who had sold us this condo 22 years ago and who sent a Christmas card every December. I told her I wanted to discuss listing the property. She said she could come Thursday afternoon. I did not tell Claire until Thursday morning. I found her in the kitchen alone. Garrett had a client meeting. I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat down. I said, "Joan Ferreira is coming this afternoon to assess the unit." Claire looked up. I said, "I've decided to sell." She said, "What?" I said it again. Her voice went thin. "Mom, where would you go?" I said I had already spoken to my sister Patricia, who had a suite in her house in Burlington that she had been offering me for 2 years, and that I had said no because I loved this home and expected to live in it. I said I had also seen 2 listings that week in a newer building 3 streets away. Claire said, "You can't just sell. This is our home right now." I said, "This is my home. You are staying here temporarily." She said, "We have nowhere to go on short notice." I said, "You have had 5 months and my address and a plan that involved making me a secondary tenant in my own condominium. I think you can manage finding somewhere to go." She started crying then, not performing real tears, and I knew the difference. I had known my daughter's tears her whole life. These were the tears of someone who had allowed a situation to go further than she had meant to and was now standing inside the consequence of that. I reached across and put my hand over hers. I said, "I love you. That has not changed and will not change. But I will not let anyone put my name on a document that takes this home from me. Not a stranger. Not Garrett. And not you, if you had let it happen." She said, "I didn't know about the secondary tenant part. I want you to know that." I believed her. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Joan came at 3 o'clock, measured and photographed, and said the market was favorable. She left me a preliminary assessment number that made me understand once again why Douglas and I had bought when we did. Garrett came home at 5:30. He walked into the living room and found Joan's business card on the coffee table and the assessment sheet beside it. He picked up the assessment sheet and read it. Then he looked at me. He said, "You're not serious." I said I was. He said, "This is reactive. This is an emotional decision." I said, "I made this decision over the course of 10 days after consulting 2 lawyers and a real estate agent. I find that fairly composed for a woman being described on the phone as someone who won't take long." His face changed. He understood then that I had heard more than he thought. He said, "Whatever you heard, it wasn't—" I said, "You can have 30 days to make arrangements. That is more than fair given the circumstances. I've already asked Andrew Seto to send over a letter outlining the timeline formally so that everyone is clear." He left the room. I heard him on the phone in the study, voice low, and this time I didn't stand in the hallway to listen. I didn't need to. That evening, my neighbor Pauline came over with wine and cheese because I had texted her, and she sat with me at the kitchen table while the evening came in blue and gray through the north-facing windows. She said, "Are you all right?" I said I was something better than all right. I said I felt like myself again. She said, "Good." She said, "Because you haven't seemed like yourself since November." She was right. I had been shrinking. Not physically, but in all the ways that matter in how I moved through my own rooms, in how often I apologized for using my own kitchen, in how long I went without sitting in my chair by the window because Garrett had placed his laptop bag there and I hadn't wanted to ask him to move it. I had been disappearing quietly from my own life, and because it happened slowly, I had almost called it normal. Over the next week, things in the condo were tense in the quiet way that is sometimes worse than noise. Garrett spoke to me minimally. Claire moved between us like someone trying not to be caught in the middle, which was, I suppose, exactly what she was. On the 5th day, something happened that I had not anticipated. Claire knocked on my bedroom door at 10 in the evening and asked if she could come in. She sat in the armchair by the window, the one Douglas had always liked, and she said, "I need to tell you something." She told me that before they had come to me in November, Garrett had proposed a different plan. He had suggested they approach me about the condo as a base for the business filing almost immediately. He had said it was obvious I was rattling around in a 2-bedroom on my own, and that the property was an underutilized asset. He had used that word asset about my home, while Douglas had been dead for 2 years. Claire said she had told him no. She said she had said absolutely not, that this was her mother's home, that they were going to stay temporarily and be grateful and cause no disruption. She said she didn't know when that had eroded. She said it happened the way things sometimes do, in small steps, each one reasonable seeming from inside the situation. Garrett kept mentioning the business plan, kept mentioning the loan, kept saying it was just paperwork, just an address, just a signature, and she had told herself that since she was managing his expectations, she was protecting me. She said, "I was not protecting you. I was managing you so that I didn't have to confront him." I sat listening. Outside the window, a siren passed on the street far below, and the sound faded, and the room was quiet again. I said, "Thank you for telling me." She said, "Are you still selling?" I said, "Yes." She nodded slowly. She said, "Okay." I said, "But that's not the end of us. That is just the end of this arrangement." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I know Garrett pushed Douglas's books. I know he put the owl in the closet. I let him do those things because I told myself they were small. I'm ashamed of that." I said, "I put the owl back every time." She almost smiled. "I know," she said. "I saw you." We sat together for a while after that without talking. That particular silence was not the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that two people share when something has been said that needed saying, and now the air is a little cleaner. Joan listed the property the following week. It moved quickly, the building had a strong reputation, the unit was well maintained, the location was good. I accepted an offer inside 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Garrett made one more attempt. He came to me one afternoon when Claire was out and said that he wanted to discuss a resolution. He said he understood things had gone wrong. He said he thought a mediated conversation might help everyone. He said he had contacts at a financial services firm who had helped families navigate these kinds of property matters. I said, "I'm not in a property dispute. I'm selling my home, which I'm entitled to do." He said that a sale at this pace could affect Claire's stability. I said, "Claire's stability is something you should have thought about before planning to restructure my tenancy status without my knowledge." He left the room. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired in the specific way you feel when you have been repeating something obvious to someone who already knows it and is simply hoping you'll stop. On the last day, I walked through every room with the moving company's lead, a woman named Barb who had a clipboard and efficient hands, and I directed what went where with the kind of certainty I had not felt in months. The ceramic owl went into my personal carry bag, wrapped in a dish towel. Douglas's remaining books, the ones Garrett hadn't donated, went into a special box that I labeled in his handwriting because I had a card he'd written me once and I had learned to copy it. Claire helped me wrap the kitchen things. Garrett was out. We worked side by side and mostly didn't talk, and it wasn't strained. It was just work. When the last box was loaded, I stood in the empty living room. The floors looked exactly the way they had when Douglas and I first saw the unit. Bare, light-filled, waiting. I had spent 22 years filling this space with a life. The life was coming with me. The space was going to someone else. That was all right. Claire stood beside me. She said, "I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know what happens with Garrett." I said, "That is between you and him. But whatever you decide it for yourself, not because he managed you into it." She looked at the floor. Then she nodded. I moved into Patricia's suite in Burlington that Saturday. It was smaller than the condo, and the ceilings were lower, and Patricia's cat knocked things off tables at 2 in the morning. But that first Sunday, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked out at Patricia's backyard, at the old birch tree and the garden beds just waking up for spring, and I thought, this is mine. This moment, this cup, this quiet. Nobody is going to tell me it's dated or inefficient or that I need to find somewhere more suitable. I placed the ceramic owl on the windowsill above the sink. It stayed there. 3 months later, Claire called me on a Sunday evening, voice careful the way it had been when she'd first asked to move in, but this time the carefulness was different. It was not the carefulness of someone asking for something. It was the carefulness of someone who was not sure of the reception and knew they had no claim on it. She said she had asked Garrett to move out of the rental they had found after I sold the condo. She said she had been seeing a counselor. She said she was not ready to say much more than that. I said, "Okay." I said, "I'm glad you called." She said, "Can I come for dinner sometime?" I said yes. I said, "Patricia makes pot roast on Sundays," and there was always enough. She came the following weekend. She brought flowers for Patricia and a small tin of my favorite shortbread. She sat at the table and talked carefully at first, and then less carefully, and by the time Patricia brought out the pot roast, something had loosened in the room that I hadn't realized was still tight. After dinner, she helped me wash the dishes. We stood side by side at the sink the way we used to when she was younger and Sundays were simpler. At one point, she looked at the ceramic owl on the windowsill and said, "I always liked that thing." I said, "Your grandmother gave it to me." She said, "I know. I remember when she gave it to you." I said, "Then you know why I kept putting it back." She was quiet for a moment, then she said yes. Douglas would have had opinions about all of this. He had always been able to see Garrett more clearly than I allowed myself to, and he had said so once or twice in the careful way he said things he knew I wasn't ready to hear. He would have been glad about the owl, I think. He would have been glad about the Sunday pot roast, and Claire at the table, and the fact that I had stopped apologizing for taking up space in my own life. I learned some things that year that I want to say clearly, because they matter. A home is not just an address or an asset or a line in a financial document. It is the place where your life has taken shape, where your memories are threaded into the walls, and where your dignity lives day to day. Nobody has the right to take that from you, not a stranger, not someone with papers and polished language, and not someone who shares your last name. Kindness is not the same as permission. Letting someone stay in your home is an act of love. Letting them erase you from it is not love, and it does not become love because the person asking is family. Silence, when you swallow it to keep the peace, does not stay small. It grows. And eventually it takes up so much room that you begin to disappear around it. The most protective thing you can do for yourself, and sometimes for the people you love, is to speak before the silence becomes the whole story. If someone tells you a document is routine and you should sign quickly, the only routine response is to slow down. Honest arrangements do not require urgency. Traps do. And finally, it is never too late to put the owl back on the shelf. Whatever has been moved, dismissed, boxed up, or made to feel like it doesn't belong, whatever of yourself, you have allowed to be put away to keep someone else comfortable, you are allowed to bring it back out. Every single time. That is what I know. My name is Eleanor Marsh, and I learned it a little later than I should have, but I learned it while there was still plenty of time to live by it. If this story reached you, leave a comment and tell me. When someone you love crosses a line, do you speak up right away, or do you wait, hoping things will settle on their own? I'd like to know. I think most of us already know the answer, and sometimes we just need someone else to say it first.